Faking the news and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials and the Millennial. Joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. You know, we should actually show a picture of you because no one knows what you look like. They're like, no, he's not really there. He's not really a millennial. Yes, he's really a millennial. He's really there. So welcome, everyone. And thank you, Christopher, for being here. This podcast is titled Faking the News. Now, look, folks, we have some incredible stories to tell you about, and you're going to think that you are actually living in a communist country like the CCP. You're going to think that you're living in North Korea, but you actually aren't. You are living in the United States of America, which is why we're calling this podcast Faking the News. First up, an update on the Ohio Senate race. So J.D. Vance, who is the Republican candidate for United States Senate in Ohio, is running against Tim Ryan. So Tim Ryan is the Democrat, and Tim Ryan, as we've told you guys before, is one of these classic Democrats who tells everybody when he's in Ohio how he's blue collar, he's one of them, oh yeah, he's just like a regular guy and so forth. And then he goes to Washington and he votes with the elites all day long. And so J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan had a recent debate, recent as in just a couple of days ago, and J.D. Vance just wiped him off of the floor. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a clip. I want you to listen to this, and it's important, this clip, because it goes to kind of a broader teaching moment for the Republican Party, namely that everyone knew in 2022 the Democrats were going to say, well, you must be a MAGA Republican and therefore you're an extremist and MAGA Republicans need to be wiped off the face of the earth, which, by the way, Tim Ryan said, and he said many times prior to the debate. And so J.D. Vance was ready for this. And now the Democrats are actually wishing they had never said that because J.D. Vance says something that's just more reasonable. We have the clip of this debate. And here it is.
We need leaders who have courage to take on their own party. And I've proven that. And he was called an ass kisser by the former president.
The question is the biggest threat to democracy.
Sure.
If you would like to answer that first, and then you can respond to some of his accusations.
So I will answer the question, Colleen, because I think it's important for the voters for us to actually answer the questions. But first of all, I'm not going to take lectures on dignity and self-respect from a guy caught on video kissing up to Chuck Schumer and begging him for a promotion to his next job. That's the kind of guy that Tim Ryan is. Now, he just said, it's so funny, we're getting close to Halloween, and Tim Ryan is put on a costume where he pretends to be a reasonable moderate. But in fact, he said he stands up to his own party. The last two Congresses, Tim, you voted for Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden 100%. You consistently toe the party line on every single issue. I wish that you were the reasonable moderate. You said you were, because then Youngstown may have not lost 50,000 manufacturing jobs during your 20 years.
So that was just crushed Tim Ryan. So that was J.D. Vance at the end saying, yeah, Youngstown lost 50,000 jobs during the years that you have served as a United States congressman representing Youngstown and other surrounding areas. But now, Tim Ryan, you're going to be a United States senator. And you have voted 100% of the time for the past 2 years, which, ladies and gentlemen, is true. Tim Ryan has voted 100% of the time for the last 2 years with Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. So why does this matter? It matters because J.D. Vance has flipped the conversation about you are a MAGA Republican, or you are someone who's going to do whatever Donald Trump tells you. And J.D. Vance just turns around. And by the way, did you hear how Tim Ryan used that language at the very beginning? So incredibly inappropriate. You kiss his A. And why is that necessary in a debate? I think that in and of itself turns a lot of people off because you're trying to, it just shows that Tim Ryan was off of his game. He knows that he's being exposed as the phony that he is. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make something really clear, too. In the United States of America, it has been the Republican Party and the Democrat Party who have largely sold out the working men and women of this country. That is the people that work in the factories, the people that work in blue-collar jobs, the people that work in manufacturing. These kinds of jobs, they've been sold out for many decades by the Republicans and the Democrats as those jobs have been exported overseas. That is a fact. The difference is, in this particular Ohio United States Senate race, you have J.D. Vance, who grew up in Appalachia. Okay, that's where he grew up. He grew up dirt poor. His mother was an addict, a drug addict. And his father was not around at all. I mean, he was just completely gone, absentee. I'm not sure if his father had passed or just was gone altogether. And he was raised by his grandmother. And he managed to see the decay of his community that had been caused by drugs. In addition to drugs, also by just pure desperation. And the desperation was a result of a lack of opportunity. That is to say, the manufacturing jobs and the jobs that once existed in the region where he lived had evaporated. And for those of you who know your geography, of course, Ohio overlaps. There are parts of Ohio that are very much like West Virginia. There are parts of Pennsylvania that are like West Virginia and vice versa. And this is important because you have a lot of overlapping voters. But one of the common themes that you have in Ohio is you have an enormous blue-collar voter base. Tim Ryan, of course, acting like, oh, I'm one of you, I support you, and then turns around and is exposed, really probably for the first time in a head-to-head debate, by a very smart J.D. Vance, who actually lived the life of desperation, lived the life of an area decaying from drugs, and people turned to drugs in the Appalachian region because of the fact that there was so little opportunity. So they felt depressed, they felt dejected, they felt unimportant as their elected officials were selling them out. Tim Ryan being one of those elected officials. And so we just have that particular clip for you in that debate. But there was another part of the debate that was brought up, and that is J.D. Vance was talking about pharmaceutical companies and so forth, and Tim Ryan was talking about the cost of medical care. Important subject in Ohio, as it is across the country. So J.D. Vance responds, quote, this guy, referring to Tim Ryan, J.D. Vance says, this guy is the biggest fan of pharma, and he's the biggest fan of illegal pharma, which is the Mexican drug cartels that are bringing this poison into our country, namely opioids and fentanyl and so forth. You name the drug, and it's being brought in. And those drugs are destroying towns where the economic opportunity is no longer there. So people are bored because they don't have work. They don't have anything to do. They're on the public dole. So they turn to drugs. But Tim Ryan is saying, oh, well, J.D. Vance isn't doing enough about medical care. And it's like, well, dude, people are on drugs and you're allowing all these illegals to traffic drugs across the border. And in addition to that, you are one of the biggest single recipients of Big Pharma in terms of actual donations. And you're telling me I'm the guy that's the bad guy? I don't think so. Moreover, J.D. Vance is like, I'm the guy that grew up in this region of Appalachia, that overlaps, of course, Ohio and Pennsylvania, West Virginia. And I'm the guy that grew up there, and my family suffered because of these very issues, and nothing has changed. Nothing. So you have one candidate who can speak to the issues because he's lived them, and he's very committed to fixing them. And another candidate who's just the same old BS rubber stamp phony who goes home and tells everybody, I'm one of you. Yo, let me put my blue collar shirt on with my name tag on it. And then, of course, goes to Washington and votes all the time with Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because it demonstrates and should illustrate to our podcast listeners why candidate quality is so important. Candidate quality is not just for winning elections. It's also because you have someone who is actually intelligent enough to want to fix things and is committed to fixing things. And that is definitely J.D. Vance. I have to tell you, I'm hoping he wins. I'm praying this guy wins because he's one of those individuals who can bring a lot of solutions based on his past to not just to the state of Ohio, but also to the United States of America, because he's not going to put up with these sellout rhinos who are selling their country out to China and to other countries. And he's not going to put up with the sellout Democrats who are doing the same thing. He's going to repatriate jobs back to the United States, which is where they belong, so that people won't be so bored and so destitute that they feel like they have to turn to drugs in order to be able to find happiness. And so, way to go, J.D. Vance. We wish you well in this upcoming election next month in November. So, next up, podcast listeners, the Dems run a network of fake news sites. So, we're calling this podcast Faking the News. As you may recall, it was just the beginning of this year when the Biden administration wanted to establish a disinformation board as part of the Department of Homeland Security. Imagine that. In a free society where the First Amendment says that you can say what you want, and there should be absolutely, really no limits. We have a president of the United States and his administration that's saying, oh no, we're going to create very stringent limits on what you can say because, and we're going to also tell people who are publishers to make sure that they don't allow you to say it. We're also going to tell the actual tech companies who say they aren't publishers, but obviously they are, because by definition, a publisher is someone who edits. We're going to tell the tech companies to continue editing what you say and to eliminate it or hide it from public view, or maybe just deplatform you altogether. We talked about this a few months ago, the disinformation board. Then we were told by the Department of Homeland Security, there really isn't a disinformation board. It's not going to happen. But if it did happen, we know that the Republicans are the ones that are disseminating disinformation or misinformation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, get this. In the Epoch Times, Democrats are running a network of fake local news sites in battleground states. This has been reported. So Democrats are running a network of quasi-local news websites to spread pro-Democrat messages in swing states ahead of the midterm elections, according to reports. The network, according to Axios, encompasses at least 51 local news outlets across 10 swing states, with each of them having a nonpartisan sounding name, such as the Milwaukee Metro Times, the Tri-City Record, and the Mecklenburg Herald. So in other words, made up websites as if these are legit newspapers that have gone totally electronic on the web, created them out of nowhere, the Democrats have, so that they can put and plant fake stories. These sites share a common template which mixes sports stories and other local news with political content that is heavily biased towards Democrat candidates and against their Republican competitors. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have to stop here and tell you that, and I've mentioned this story before briefly. This is important. This is really important. There was a company out of Indiana about 7 years ago, that started buying up newspapers, local newspapers only across the country. So this company they decided, we're going to be in the local news print business. And they bought out papers that were still printing the printed version of the newspaper, as well as papers that had, in addition to that printed version, an online version of the same newspaper. And this same company bought out the newspaper that was in my community. Now, my community used to have 2 local newspapers, and they were rich with local information. Yes, it had local high school sports, local club sports, local clubs in general, like the Knights of Columbus and obviously the Elks Club and all these different things that were happening in the community. They had information about government and politics, obviously, and weather information and park information when parks open and close. A lot of rich, truly important information when you really want to get involved in your local community. Well, this company in Indiana purchased this local newspaper. And the local newspaper, of course, put the other paper out of business. So then we were down to one paper. Next thing you know, the newspaper reported on the front page only stories that were negative towards Republicans. Negative. And they, of course, had an editorial page, the newspaper, just like the newspaper before it, prior to them buying it. And the editorial page would accept letters to the editor from citizens in the community, and they would print those letters to the editor. Their only their only parameters for printing were that the letters to the editor had to be no longer than X amount of words, which made sense, right? Because it's a newspaper, and there's only so much paper you can use to print letters to the editor. And also it takes time to get this information online, because this was a time when people were, and this is just a few years ago, by the way, when people would mail in their letters to the editor. Sometimes they would email them in, so that you could just copy and paste it and post it. But nonetheless, the newspaper is like, yeah, we're going to print anything that's a letter to the editor that you send to us. And we only have this one request. It's just X amount of words, no more than that. If you do send us more than X amount of words, we have the right to edit it to, bring it back to where it belongs. No sooner did this newspaper in Indiana purchase our local newspaper, they put the other newspaper, that's the local paper, out of business. They changed the editorial page policy about 6 months before the election. And they didn't tell anyone that they had changed it. And there were people that were sending in letters to the editor about candidates, letters to the editor about issues that were important to the local community, because remember, it's supposed to be a local newspaper. And this newspaper basically sent back the editor, and the assistant editor would send people emails saying, oh, we've read your letter to the editor, and we've decided that it's not true, or that it's biased, and therefore we're not going to put it in and on our editorial page. And it's like, dude, letters to the editor are supposed to be biased because by definition, it's someone's opinion, right? It's the person signs it. It's their opinion. So they are taking ownership of what is put on that page, the letters to the editor page. So, again, if you write an article about I think taxes should be lower, and you explain all those reasons, and these candidates say they're going to lower taxes, and that's why I'm supporting them, and then you sign your name at the bottom, that's what that particular letter to the editor would look like. But the local newspaper, since it had now been owned by this pretty large conglomerate, decided to do what? They decided to censor what was being put on the editorial page from letters to the editor from local citizens. And they essentially said, without actually saying so, if it's something that has to do with conservatism or lower taxes or criticizing candidates who are Democrats, we're going to make sure that it does not get printed. And they literally would send you emails to that effect. We think it's biased, so therefore we're not going to put it. We've fact-checked and realized that the facts don't support, the evidence that you put in. It's like, dude, it is a letter to the editor. It's my opinion. So I gave you that long explanation because now we see that this was actually coordinated, and it was coordinated and started many years ago, probably a decade ago. And to be fair, part of the rolling up of local newspapers is a result of the loss of advertising because of online advertising and Google essentially gutting the local news business. But also because there was this coordinated effort, and you have to ask yourself the question, why is it that the only companies that buy local newspapers turn them from locally based newspapers that are nonpartisan to highly partisan far left newspapers? And my community is definitely right of center. And they're putting all these articles in this newspaper that are like far left. And it's like, dude, the people here are not going to buy your newspapers. They don't want to know about what's happening in Washington. They don't want to know what's happening in these far left blue counties. They already know. And they live here because they want to learn what's happening in their community. So, not to be outdone, the Democrat Party, according to Axios, a left-wing newspaper, has decided that they are going to put 51 local news outlets across 10 swing states, totally made-up newspapers like the Tri-City Record and the Mecklenburg Herald and the Milwaukee Metro Times, so they can plant phony stories in those newspapers. So they're phony newspapers with phony stories. Now, this is coming from the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party, by the way, is funding this, and Democrat donors. They're doing this, and this is the same party that wanted a disinformation board to determine what was true and what wasn't The government doing that, of course, determining what's true and what's not. And yet, here they are engaging in exactly what they said that they wanted to stop. So the sites are purportedly run by a 1-year-old Florida-based company called Local Report. And they may also be partly run by American Independent, a progressive media company owned by Hillary Clinton-affiliated investment firm True Blue Media. Considering that the bulk of these sites' content is produced by the American Independent writers. So here's the thing. So the Democrats have invested in media companies that then invest in these papers that are made up. So literally, they're creating a network of newspapers that are making stuff up and creating disinformation so that they can win elections. Now, folks, in a properly functioning republic, you would have an independent media that would be investigating these newspapers and who's behind them and exposing the fact that they're phony and that they're just rags, right? But because we don't have true journalism hardly anymore, there's some, but generally speaking, we don't have it. We don't have this way of knowing, in many cases, what is real and what is fake. I mean, I think most people are smart enough to determine the difference, but I think this is why the Democrats are trying to confuse people and say that's why we need a disinformation board. And of course, if there were a disinformation board that was federally run with your tax dollars, we know how that would go. It would literally be gutting the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. So, according to Axios, almost all of these sites' content comes from just 6 American independent writers. So just 6 writers, right? 6 authors are writing all these stories. And the authors' articles appear nowhere else other than the sites within the Local Report network. So this is pretty smart, okay? And that's kind of where I'm going with this. It's pretty smart because these are Democrats who are using money from their donors to create fake sites. And those fake sites are being used in swing states to create what? Fake news and or just faking the news, but they'll put a couple of stories in there about local sports teams. And those local sports team stories will probably be true. So then you think, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. This is a new site. I'm going to go to this site. I've never seen it before. And then you see a hit piece on the Republican running for either a local, state, or federal office. And you're like, oh, wow, man. That's really bad. Oh, my gosh. And this is the danger right now when you have the concentration of media and the distribution of the same controlled by big tech. So I just want to be really clear about this. Anyone can create a website that is a news site. Anyone can create their own online newspaper, and you can do it probably in the matter of a couple of hours, to be quite frank. And you can get a couple of stories out there pretty quickly, to be quite frank. All right. The difference is that in order to distribute online those news sources, big tech can cancel you. They can find ways of censoring you and stopping others from seeing your news pieces and your articles. And the Democrats, of course, have a complete partnership with big tech to be able to limit distribution of conservative sites and or just fair news reporting versus, of course, their own news sites. And so things have changed dramatically from having many different competitive newspapers where you had journalism as a true profession where people really cared about reporting just what happened. And it's changed, of course, from people that are just party affiliates and they're party, of course, activists. So why does this matter? It matters because now this writing and lack of journalism and this control by big tech of the message is now expanding to different areas of the economy. So as big tech has gotten into the business of destabilizing industries and taking them over and or becoming important parts of those industries, they're using that leverage to stop your speech. PayPal, ladies and gentlemen. PayPal has been engaged in something that you're just not going to believe. So if you pay for something online with your credit card, you buy a product online, the chances are pretty good, or if you have a fundraiser yourself, the chances are pretty good you're paying with your credit card through PayPal. So PayPal on October 8th sent out an update to its terms of use or acceptable use policy that included a shocking addition. PayPal reserved the right to confiscate $2,500 from people's accounts if they spread misinformation. Can you believe that? True story, ladies and gentlemen. We know it's true because, as we'll tell you in a minute, PayPal had a massive pushback of this and a massive drop in their stock. It was a clear announcement of what many already suspected PayPal has enlisted in the information war. So you have fake news sites being created by the Democrat Party. And by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if Republicans have created fake news sites. Difference is the Democrats already own the media, okay? And then when you have a donation to your campaign or to your business, for example, or a purchase through your business account, you may be using PayPal. Ladies and gentlemen, for full disclosure, for my campaign, for the Maryland House of Delegates, we use PayPal. And I think we should change and find something different. I mean, because this story just came out, so this is so new, you can't turn on a dime, but we're going to have to. So PayPal said it reserves the right to confiscate $2,500. This is the number that they gave from people's accounts if those people spread misinformation. And that misinformation is solely, that word misinformation, is solely up to the interpretation of PayPal. So in other words, PayPal is saying we have the right to steal $2,500 from your account because we don't like what you're saying. This comes weeks after PayPal blocked several important accounts in the United Kingdom, including Toby Young's personal account, the Free Speech Union, and the Daily Skeptic. These are largely and hugely important venues for the English-speaking world in countering the COVID propaganda narrative. It was no accident that they were targeted. After global protests and news coverage from alternative sources, PayPal relented and restored their accounts without explanation. In a similar vein, protests all over the world poured in about PayPal's new policy. Twitter filled up with announcements from people who were canceling their accounts. By the following day, PayPal reversed itself, claiming that the banning of misinformation was just a mistake. Yeah, just a mistake. Like right before the election, it's just a mistake. A spokesman of the AOP notice recently went out in an era. Here's what they said, PayPal. A recent notice went out in an error that included incorrect information. A spokesman told the Epoch Times, PayPal is not fining people for misinformation, and this language was never intended to be inserted in our policy. In other words, PayPal claimed that its policy on misinformation was itself misinformation, which is just ridiculous. It's very likely that the user protest itself and a big sell-off in PayPal stock made the crucial difference. So let me repeat this, ladies and gentlemen. It's likely that the vast amount of PayPal users who received this notice from PayPal, that $2,500 could be confiscated from their account. And a lot of the people who own PayPal stock decided to sell off their PayPal stock, that this made a crucial difference in why PayPal reversed its policy. So remember, PayPal is a publicly traded company. A publicly traded company is not supposed to be in the business of getting involved in what you can and cannot say. This is a banking business, PayPal. It's about banking. You bank through PayPal, okay? You pay for things through PayPal. PayPal is a de facto bank. It's a clearinghouse for transactions. It's very important to our economy. And yet, they're basically telling you that if you have the wrong opinions, they can take your money and or deplatform you. Well, they did that same thing in Canada, where the Canadian government convinced the online sites where you could donate money to basically confiscate the money that was meant for the truckers to be able to support them in their protests against the lockdown policies of Canada. Same thing here, except that with PayPal, they had such an incredible pushback and drop in their stock and people canceling their PayPal accounts. The PayPal was like, oh, yeah, we didn't really mean any of that stuff. That was just a mix. So I have to ask podcast listeners, you a question. What does it look like in the inner circle at these kinds of companies like PayPal, where you have a boardroom and executives sitting around the boardroom table, not talking about how they're going to expand their business, because it's a publicly traded company, not talking about how they're going to improve the value of their stock for the shareholders, not talking about how they're going to improve the user experience for the PayPal users, but instead talking about how they can rip off your money based on your political beliefs. What does that look like? What does that look like when people get around it? I mean, don't you think that it's time for Congress to act on this? At a minimum, Congress could pass a bill that states that it is unlawful and that there is a heavy fine, and maybe the fine should be maybe the fine should be a percentage of the PayPal stock that's paid to the U.S. Treasury, or maybe paid to some sort of journalistic school, or maybe it requires the executives to actually take a course in what the First Amendment really means. I'm not sure what exactly the penalty should be, but what I'm saying is the U.S. government, Congress, should pass a law. And the law should say that you are prohibited when you are a publicly traded company, okay? You are prohibited when you are a publicly traded company from stopping people from using your company's services and products simply because of your belief system and because of your political point of view. Because a publicly traded company is supposed to act on the best interests of making money. And that is supposed to be separate, completely separate from getting involved in politics. But look, this tells you what's really happening and what has been happening in Silicon Valley. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we're calling this podcast the Faking the News. Because we're calling it Faking the News because we have this coordinated effort between the Democrat Party and these big news outlets. And of course, the Disinformation Board, which I personally believe still exists in the federal government, which is coordinating to be able to stop the dissemination of information about how awfully the Democrats are running our country into the ground and how quickly they're doing it. So the PayPal change was so obviously approved at the highest levels, it was intended to stick, and PayPal had every intention of preparing the way to confiscate funds from people based on their political loyalties and opinions. This is truly how bad things have gotten, as I continue to read in the Epoch Times article. I'm particularly intrigued by the way in which the Washington Post has reported on the story. PayPal is facing blowback after proposing rules that would have allowed it to fine users $2,500 for promoting misinformation, which the online payment service has since called an error. This is what the Washington Post said. Quote, over the weekend, several conservative outlets reported that the tech company updated its terms of agreement under which PayPal can levy fines against users for violations to include the sending, posting, or publication of any messages, content, or materials that promote misinformation. The update immediately sparked uproar online on the right, marking the latest instance that a major online payment service has faced heat over its moderation practices. Moderation. It's a banking service. And ladies and gentlemen, do you think that this ought not worry you if we go to an all digital currency? Right? So people pay you through PayPal, the clearing service. PayPal then holds that money in your account. Someone used a credit card, or they wired money to your PayPal account, but almost always it's a credit card. They've used the credit card. PayPal then is the clearinghouse that holds that money for you. It's your money. It's your money. And then once that happens, that's digital. Okay. It's dollars represented in digits. It's digital. You can't like actually grab and hold the $100 bills in your hand. You would have to then transfer that money from PayPal to your bank and then go to your bank and get the money and put it in your hands before you actually have the money in your hands to be able to use, to touch, so that no one can take it from you. But if we had an exclusive digital currency, you couldn't do that. And now these idiots at PayPal and the idiots in the federal government, if they're still in charge, or if they do get in charge, no matter who they are, no matter what party they're from, could potentially take that digital currency from you, just wipe it out and put, oh, now it's zero. That's what PayPal's saying. We can zero out your accounts. Sure we can, because we don't like what you're saying. And then you have a federal government that's like going hand in hand with this, saying, well, let's just go to digital currency, because then we can use that as leverage to be able to not only steal from people, but control their actions. You no longer live in a free society when you have a government that has caused you to say you can only pay with digital currency. Scary stuff. It really is. So Elon Musk liked a tweet that went out, and we had, let me see, the former president of PayPal, David Marcus, wrote, and this is the former president of PayPal. He wrote on Twitter, quote, "It's hard for me to openly criticize a company I used to love and gave so much to, but PayPal's new policies go against everything I believe in. A private company now gets to decide to take your money if you say something they disagree with? Insanity." Elon Musk liked the tweet. Then Brendan Carr, a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, weighed in. Orwellian. PayPal reserves the right to take your money if you post a message that PayPal decides is misinformation. This is why it's so vital that state and federal legislatures pass laws that prohibit discrimination by tech companies and protect free speech. Well, there you go. We now know how exactly what big tech companies mean by misinformation. They mean information that belies regime priorities. It began with COVID and extended to vaccines. Ah, yes. Of course it did, ladies and gentlemen. Because even on this podcast, when we were talking to Dr. Jim Small, I don't know, a month or so ago on this podcast, we titled the podcast, Don't Ask Questions. Remember, this is a doctor, okay, who's the head of OBGYN for a major hospital chain and was let go because of his observations about the vaccine and pregnant mothers and their children. Okay. He was asking questions. So we called him in, did a podcast, and we decided to title the podcast, Don't Ask Questions. And then YouTube took it off the air. Like it had barely been on the air for, it was like, how long, Chris? Was it? It's just like a short time.
It never got up.
Never got up. Yeah. They did. So YouTube, a major tech company, a utility type company, decided that the title was enough to trigger them, Don't Ask Questions, and they wouldn't allow it to be posted, Don't Ask Questions. It's unbelievable. And so you see this happening across all the big tech companies. And the latest one, of course, is PayPal, as we just discussed. It is fascinating, but it doesn't stop there. Because why, ladies and gentlemen, was PayPal and why were their executives so triggered that they thought that people ought not be able to have access to the money that belongs to them and that PayPal gets to steal your money based on what you say? Well, it's in part because of what, if not completely in part, because of what the Biden administration is doing. Political operation. Trump DOJ official sounds alarm over call to prosecute social media users spreading disinformation. So this is in the Daily Caller. A spokesman for the Department of Justice, this person served under Donald Trump, told the Daily Caller that the recent letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland calling for an investigation on social media users spreading disinformation. So just to give you the background, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, called for an investigation of social media companies who saw individuals spreading disinformation about child sex changes. So imagine that, right? So you have a public school system in many counties across the country and in certain states as a whole who say that your child can receive counseling in as early as elementary school about changing their sex and identifying as a different sex with or without your consent as a parent. And then you have Merrick Garland saying, well, you can't talk about this on social media. So you don't know what's happening to your child because your public school system isn't telling you. And I know this for a fact, ladies and gentlemen, because in my own state, they passed a law that literally said just that. So I'm talking from experience. I know the state of Maryland passed a law that says your child can receive counseling and can identify as the gender that they want to identify with in the public school system without your consent at any time. And it's up to the discretion of the school, not to you as the parent. And now we have Merrick Garland saying, well, that would be disinformation if you decided to criticize this publicly on social media. And you got PayPal saying, well, not only that, we're going to take $2,500 of your account if you're one of those individuals who uses PayPal and is engaged in any kind of criticism of these insane policies. Insane policies, to be clear, ladies and gentlemen, is, as an example, is a policy that says that parents don't get to know what is happening to their children in the public school systems, that parents don't get to know about the curriculum, they don't get informed about the curriculum, and the parents aren't informed about their children's activities in the school, and the school gets to decide on all of these things. Just insane, okay? And we know that California, of course, passed legislation to punish doctors for talking about COVID shots and asking for individuals to get more information about them. So why does that matter? Why does that matter? Well, because California has actually gotten into the attack on the First Amendment by saying if you're a doctor and you're engaging in informed consent with your patient, and part of that informed consent is, well, ma'am, you haven't gotten the vaccine yet, and there are some new things we've learned about it, and we want you to take a look at. California saying you can be prosecuted as a doctor, and we can take away your license. So we actually have states engaging in this. And then I think Chris sent me an article here, and it is from, let me see, the Financial Review. U.S. Republicans pull $1.6 billion from BlackRock over ESG concerns. So again, ESG, it's, what is it? It's an environmental, social, and governance. Is that what it is? Government's policies basically saying that publicly traded companies are companies that ought not be about engaging in value and increasing in value for shareholders. Instead, they should be part of this woke corporate agenda. And as a result, Republicans have taken $1.6 billion out of BlackRock. And by the way, it ought to be a lot more than that. Hopefully, people will start realizing, I'm going to just use my $1.6 billion, Republicans. I'm just saying collectively, the Republicans, to just go buy stocks that you believe in individually and not just put it in these big funds who act as your agent. Just buy Exxon. Go buy Exxon. Go buy the natural gas stocks. Buy the oil stocks directly. You can do that all day long, right? I mean, you can open up an account today with any of these companies like Fidelity and Wells Fargo and so forth. You can buy them with no charge other than the actual cost of the stock itself, and hold those stocks in your own account. Don't buy BlackRock or any of these other idiots, Vanguard or whatever. I don't trust any of them, okay? I just don't. So good for you, Republicans, for doing that. But we also have the Republican AGs. They sue Biden's ex-COVID czar for alleged censorship efforts. That's a new article that's out too. So, folks, you have to ask yourself the question, and this is really important. You have to ask yourself the question, how do we fix this problem where Democrats are faking the news, and at the same time, they fundamentally do not believe anymore in the First Amendment? So it's one thing for people on the left to say that they're all in on child sex change operations as young as 6th grade. Okay, I'm talking about the left. It's one thing for them to say that, which I personally think is child abuse and disgusting, obviously, and criminal. That's what I believe. I'm allowed to have that opinion. That's what the First Amendment is for. Are they allowed to have this absurd opinion as well? Yes, they are. And what we need is a journalist and journalism in general to be honest, to actually report, well, this is what Mark believes. And here's why he believes it. And here's what John Smith believes. And this is why he believes it. And then you're just reporting what is, and then you can let people make up their minds about it. You could also ask doctors their opinions. But unfortunately, we don't have that now because we have the distribution of news controlled by these large tech companies. It's the only way you can get your news out there unless you want to do the absurd task, which of course it would be absurd, of printing newspaper on newsprint all over again and distributing it house by house by house by house, which would be phenomenally expensive, way too expensive. And I'm not sure anybody would read it anyway because everybody reads their stuff online now. I mean, there's a small percentage of people that still read newspapers, but for the most part, people read all of their news online. And since that is the case, and since the media companies, okay, the social media companies and the distribution companies that distribute these news stories have decided to censor you, you can't get the information out there. So Congress has to act on this. And we almost need a national conversation. We do need a national conversation about this idea of misinformation and disinformation. Because, folks, it's called free speech, right? You're allowed to have an opinion even when the opinion is wrong. That's what free speech is about, okay? It's not misinformation, disinformation that should be banned. It's just an opinion. And sometimes, of course, opinions change because people get more information. More information is better. But unfortunately, we live at a time in the United States when there are so many Democrats who don't believe in free speech. And by the way, these are highly educated individuals, right? We're not talking about people that aren't particularly bright. We're talking about the Democrat elites who truly do not believe in the First Amendment. It's the most remarkable thing I have ever seen. And I've mentioned this before to a couple of my colleagues, and I've never mentioned this, I don't think, on the show before, Chris. But Chris was there, by the way, Christopher Hopkins, our producer, and I was on the House floor of the Maryland House of Delegates, and I was debating, and I said my personal opinion is the Democrat Party, and I went down this road of talking about the Democrat Party, and the Speaker of the House stood up and got this gavel, and if you can imagine an oversized, like massive gavel, and she's gaveling me down, bang, 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 bang. Well, I kept talking, but very measured, just like I'm talking now, and the Speaker says, excuse me, you cannot use the word Democrat. Like, what? Wait, excuse me. Wait a minute. I'm really confused. Like, this chamber is made up of Democrats and Republicans. Granted, the Democrats are a supermajority in the Maryland House of Delegates. And you're saying that I can't use a word and the word is Democrats. Yeah, I mean, at one point, she was so upset with the gaveling, she gobble, 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 that it sounds like turkey, right? Gobble, gobble, but it's gobble, gobble. The next day, because we have session every day, the next day, she spent the first 5 to 8 minutes of session telling the entire chamber of 141 members how inappropriate it was to say Democrat on the House floor. It should never be said. And of course, I'm thinking to myself, these are people that are really embarrassed to be Democrats because That's why they don't want it to be said, because I was matching their policies with their party. And that is a fact because they're the ones who pass all the bills in Annapolis because they control it overwhelmingly. And therefore, that's what I did. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're seeing in real time, and I'm seeing real time, this incredibly odd censorship and misunderstanding, lack of education, or intentional censorship of free speech in America. And it's by the elites. It's by those who are in control. And this, not only is this wrong, it is so incredibly dangerous. It's so incredibly dangerous. And speaking of dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, there were so many Americans who were upset during the 2020 election. By so many, like half the country. Half the country thought it was really odd that during the 2020 election, there were emergency orders put forth by governors across the country, mostly in blue states, by the way, or swing states, where the governors were Democrats and decided that because of COVID, we were going to do mass mailing out of ballots, whether you wanted one or not. We've talked about this before. And there was massive censorship where you couldn't really talk about why you thought this was wrong and what could potentially happen if we had mass mailing out of ballots. We've all talked about this ad nauseum since 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a new story. A new story. And the company is called Konnech Election Software. It's Konnech. I'm thinking it's Konnech or Konnech, but I think it's Konnech Election Software. That's at least how it's spelled, Konnech. Their CEO, who was arrested earlier for ties to China and labeled a significant flight risk, was caught with luggage on his way to the Michigan airport just this week. He left behind a cell phone. He has substantial ties to China. So listen to this. So earlier this week, the Gateway Pundit reported about a significant arrest that took place in LA County, California, related to the 2020 elections. On September 8th, which was last month, reporters from 100% Fed Up and the Gateway Pundit attended the pit where True the Vote's Catherine Engelbrecht and Greg Phillips dropped a bombshell about the arrest of Eugene Yu, the CEO of Konnech, an East Lansing, Michigan-based company. It's technically where he's based. Of course, Michigan, important swing state. Responsible for the software used in managing elections in several states that stored personal information of over 1 million Americans in its database. So Konnech, much like Dominion, almost immediately sued True the Vote as a way to silence them and keep them from speaking out about the bombshell information they provided to reporters at the pit related to Konnech and the unlawful transfer of information from America to China, because some of the servers, ladies and gentlemen, were in China. So you got this guy, he's Chinese American, and decides to do what? He's technically working for the CCP, and he owns an election software company that is actually being used by some states and some counties in the United States of America. And now it's been found out that it's like kind of crooked. So the story goes on. And then, of course, we see some other stories that have broken out. The Epoch Times. So the Epoch Times decides to write about not just this story about Konnech software, but about the New York Times itself and the New York Times reporting of the 2020 election as it relates to the software company. So get this in the Epoch Times. The title, New York Times updates the article that claimed conspiracy theory against election software company after charges were announced. So the New York Times has added an editor's note to an article, meaning that they have changed the online article that the New York Times published on October 3rd, claiming that allegations against a Michigan-based election software company were a conspiracy theory. So the New York Times is saying, well, the dude, just because he's Chinese and was arrested by the FBI and cooperating with the CCP, it's a conspiracy theory that somehow he was trying to rig the 2020 election. So one day later, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon announced charges against the CEO of Connex Software, the company, for allegedly stealing and storing election worker data on servers in China. After this article was published, the chief executive of Connex, Eugene Yu, was arrested in connection with an investigation into the possible theft of personal information about poll workers, the New York Times note says. In communications with the Times for this article, neither Mr. Yu nor a spokesman for Connex said the company was the subject of an investigation. They also asserted that all the company's data was stored on servers in the U.S. Prosecutors in Los Angeles who brought the charges against Mr. Yu said that they had found some company data stored on servers in China. The Times is continuing to report on this story, it added. The New York Times spokesman did not respond to a request for comment. So in other words, ladies and gentlemen, at this late date, we have a situation where we have the New York Times still covering for the CCP because they dare to say that somehow we should never look behind the curtain and find out what's really happening with election. Why are election software products being provided to us by these people who have connections to overseas anyway? I'm just so confused. And in Fairfax County, Virginia, and I'll finish with this because I know we're running long on time. In Fairfax County, Virginia, Fairfax County is a very important county in Virginia. It just so happened that in Fairfax County, there were all of these ballots that happened to be counted and votes that happened to be counted in Fairfax County at a very late hour in Virginia, which kind of like never happens in 2020. Well, guess what? They abruptly said this week that they are no longer using Connex election software, the same software that has been put forth by this guy that has the connection to the CCP. I have to submit to you, there's probably a lot more here, and we need to find out what it is. And the question that I have is, can we really trust the FBI to really look? The problem is we don't have anybody else, right? You and I don't have the time or the resources to research this. But hopefully somebody will. And this is really serious stuff. We have counties that were using it and now are saying, oh, we're not going to use it anymore. What is it that they knew? What do they know that they're not telling us? So, as is always the case, we're going to continue to learn more about this story as it unravels and about so many other things that happened and are continuing to happen. And meanwhile, as conservatives, we just keep saying the same thing. Elections should be held on the day of the election, and people should be able to show up and required to show up and show their voter ID. And guess what happens then? It's really hard to cheat then. It really is. It really is. And all ballots should be paper ballots. Fine, scan the paper ballots in, but you still need the paper ballot backups. That's how you get to a place where elections are secure once again. And that's the last word from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.